Hey, what is up? So yeah, I haven't made a review of Better Call Saul Season 5 in a really long time, and honestly, I thought Season 6 would be going on by now. I'm actually pretty damn surprised that the season hasn't started yet. I thought by sure in February I'd be like, oh, well, I guess I just didn't make all 10 reviews, but I'm actually damn surprised I have time to do it. So anyway, I had some time today and hadn't talked about it in a really long time, so I'm going to review Better Call Saul Season 5, Episode 5, entitled Dedicado on Max. Really looking forward to it, and without further delay, here we go. Alright, so the cold opening scene of Season 5, Episode 5, Dedicado on Max, picks up where the end of the previous episode left off. We see Mike waking up in an unknown location, trying to get his bearings, not really understanding what happened to him after he got stabbed at the end of the previous episode. And in this scene, we see Mike get up and we see him sort of check his surroundings, kind of look where he is. Following being outside for a little bit, he returns inside and there's a woman in there. He starts speaking with her. Of course, Mike, being a very smart and perceptive man, first believes that Gus Fring had something to do with him being placed here right now. Of course, initially there's a language barrier between him and this woman. Interesting piece of foreshadowing that's going to play out over the course of this episode. Then, of course, following this, Mike, being in a very emotional and stubborn state, especially now over the previous last few episodes, decides in very Mike fashion, you know what? I'm going to leave. I'm just going to really have no plan, and I'm just going to pick up and trudge into the wilderness. I'm not having any of this. I don't want to be here. Despite my sick condition of just having a stab wound, I'm going to leave anyway. So following this, we see Mike trudge out into the wilderness of what is presumed to be Mexico at the time, again, having no real plan. And again, we can kind of see that following Mike walking for a little bit, he then stops and rests for a minute, understanding that, you know what am I doing? I'm in no condition to travel right now. Following him just sitting down, kind of getting his bearings, we then see a car approach, and it's quickly revealed to us that the person driving this car is Gus Fring's doctor, Dr. Barry Goodman. Following Dr. Goodman approaching Mike, Mike asks him what he's doing here. Dr. Goodman saying that his only job is to keep Mike alive. Will he allow him to do that? Of course, heavily implying here that without the care of Dr. Goodman in the condition Mike is in, he will absolutely die if he continues on this heinous journey with no plan. This, of course, is going to be revealed to us in full detail later in this episode. But then following this interaction between these two characters, this is what causes the cold opening scene to end. Alright, so following this, the first scene of Act 1 then picks up with the plot of Jimmy and Kim, which ended after the previous episode, where we saw Kim approach Jimmy in the Bernalillo County Courthouse asking him for a favor. It's then shown to us in this scene, we see a bunch of construction workers on the plot of Mr. Acker's land, where it's implied that they're going to demolish the house and begin construction on the call center. Of course, this sort of construction meeting is then interrupted by Jimmy McGill. So without going into too specific details of the scene, the main premise of this plot that ensues over the course of this episode is as Mr. Acker hired Jimmy at the end of the previous episode as his attorney. And in this scene, we see Jimmy using this sort of stall tactic where he'll go through all sorts of just ruses and different legal ploys in order to delay the construction of the call center on Mr. Acker's property for as long as possible. That's what we see here in this first scene of Act 1. Again, that's the main plot of this scene right here. I mean, you have to go back and rewatch this scene. This scene is absolutely hilarious to just see the back and forth interaction between Jimmy, aka Saul, the construction workers, and the police officer with Mr. Acker. Again, I can't do it justice here describing every single detail in this scene, but overall, this of course is a setup scene for the plot that's going to ensue over the course of this episode. An unbelievable plot in my opinion, and just a great piece of foreshadowing for where this plot goes over the course of episode 5. Then following this, the next scene in this act then picks up with Kim meeting with Paige and Kevin at what appears to be a golf course or a country club of some kind. And in this scene, we see Kevin and Paige getting the details of what happened with Mr. Acker and his attorney. Of course, them understanding that this is a sort of stall tactic that's being used by Mr. Acker. Kim, of course, here, being the sort of orchestrator of this whole plot, really uses some sort of pretty keen mental manipulation to sort of make Kevin and Paige believe that even though she's the one behind all of this, she's playing ignorance and says she's going to recuse herself from this case because of the conflicts of interest. But of course, this has been an entire long con for Kim, even as going back to her tearing Mr. Acker a new one in the episode prior. Of course, all of these mental ploys and mental traps being laid down, she convinces Kevin to allow her to stay on the case despite the apparent conflicts of interest with her being in a relationship with Mr. Acker's attorney. Again, another piece of setup for this plot with Mr. Acker and Mesa Verde that will continue over the course of this episode. Then, following this, the third and final scene of Act 1 then picks up with the plot of Mike and Dr. Barry Goodman. In this scene, we then see all of the more specific details that were implied to us in the cold opening scene being articulated between these two characters. In this scene, we see a very cynical and dismissive Mike talking about Gus Fring and his relationship with Dr. Barry Goodman. Of course, Dr. Goodman then telling Mike that, of course, in his condition, he's in absolutely no state to travel and he would not survive any sort of journey back to the United States. Of course, telling him to rest and recover, as is Gus Fring's plan, which we'll see come to full fruition at the end of this episode. Then, following this interaction between these two characters, we then see Mike sort of walk back into the courtyard of this small town. And then following an interesting interaction with some school children, what appears to be running through the courtyard after school, and Mike returning a backpack to a little girl who dropped it on the ground, we then see at the culmination of the scene the camera pan to a plaque on the fountain which reads Dedicado a Max, which of course all fans of Breaking Bad will understand is dedicated to Gus Fring's business partner, Max Arciniega, and of course this will be fully described to us at the end of this episode when this plot culminates with the scene that was building throughout this entire episode between Mike Ehrmantraut and Gus Fring. Alright, so then following this, the first scene in Act 2 then picks up with Jimmy at the apartment which he shares with Kim, going through an assortment of different sort of things. I mean, it's not really clear what he's doing. He's cooking something. He's about to break something in a bag. Of course, this planning is then interrupted by a phone call via Howard Hamlin. Howard calls Jimmy to discuss the job offer which he offered Jimmy in the previous episode. Here, again, we see Jimmy, of course, unbeknownst to Howard, at least directly at the time, we see a very cynical and dismissive Jimmy, of course, having absolutely no interest in this job whatsoever, but sort of, playing along with Howard, pretending he has an interest in it, of course, being totally preoccupied with what he's doing with Kim, and of course, despite sort of feigning cordialities with Howard, he hangs up on him mid-conversation. Of course, this plot between these two characters will eventually come to full circle in a later episode down the line in Season 5, of course, with the benefit of hindsight, having already seen this entire season. Then, following this, we then see Kim return home from work, following her meeting with Paige and Kevin, then informing Jimmy that the ruse paid off. She got them to believe that she was not the orchestrator of this plot and got both of them to allow Kim to stay on the case despite the apparent conflicts of interest. Of course, in this scene, we see a sort of very interesting back and forth between these two characters where we see them sort of lightheartedly joking about Kevin, Kim using a accent to sort of tell Jimmy, of course, to Jimmy's request, what happened. Of course, at the end of this episode, at the end of the scene, it culminates with these two characters agreeing to Jimmy's proposition, if you will. But anyway, despite that being the detail of this scene, in hindsight, I was kind of questioning what was the premise of this scene, what was the purpose of this scene in this episode. And with the benefit of hindsight, I think it has to do with the creator showing us that at this point in time, the relationship between these two characters is a positive one and is sort of meshing together and following Kim's moral compass sort of shifting and aligning more with Jimmy's. Their relationship is maybe strengthening at this point in time and is maybe even growing. But of course, in the grand scheme of things, this plot with Kim, as I've discussed in my previous reviews, is just going in every which direction. Of course, with us not knowing what happens with Kim in the grand scheme of things, at every single point of this show, when I think the plot of Kim is going in one direction, it then goes in a completely different direction. So of course, I think this scene just kind of displays to us the sort of, cloak and daggerness of where the plot of Kim and Jimmy is going, of course, with us having no idea. And again, this plot, I think, just further sort of confuses, in my opinion, where this relationship ends up going. Just when you think it's going one place, it very quickly in another episode goes another place. But anyway, just another piece of setup plot here for this plot that will continue over the course of this episode. Then following this, the next scene in this act then picks up with the plot of Mike Ehrmantraut back in Mexico. Here, another hilarious scene in my opinion, very subtle yet very funny. We see Mike not having a phone charger because his phone is dead. We see him sort of in very Mike Ehrmantraut fashion, starting to sort of jerry-rig a makeshift phone charger. Of course, this is interrupted by Mrs. Cortazar giving Mike a functioning phone charger despite Mike going through all this effort. A very funny scene, very subtle scene. I really enjoyed it. Of course, then following him charging his phone, he calls Gus Fring, of course, asking Gus what he is doing here. Gus, in very Gus Fring fashion, basically hangs up on Mike and tells Mike now is not a good time. Of course, Mike, understanding that, if Gus Fring's not going to tell him at this point in time, he's basically stuck here. Not too happy with this circumstance, but of course, seemingly resigned to his fate at this point in time, following Gus giving him no further information on what he's doing here. Okay, so following this, the next scene in this act then finally picks up with the sort of long, hilarious, in my opinion, montage scene that ensues. Again, I can't describe this scene in full detail. I can't do it any justice. There's so much going on here, but basically over the course of this montage scene, and I do love a good montage scene over the course of Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, we see Jimmy and Kim's plan come into full effect where through an assortment of legal loopholes and delay tactics, we see Mr. Acker being able to stay on his land for as long as possible, and the construction on Mesa Verde's call center being delayed here. Again, I can't do this scene justice. You need to go back and watch it. An absolutely hilarious scene here between Jimmy and the construction workers and the main police officer who's trying to kick Mr. Acker off his land. A hilarious scene, so much going on here. But basically, in the end, following all of these delay tactics, after this scene, we then see Kim meeting with Paige and Kevin, giving them the laydown of all these stall tactics that are preventing Mr. Acker from leaving his land. Of course, following all of these legal ploys showing no end in sight, Kim, of course, again propositions her initial plot in the previous episode of building the call center on a different plot of land and thus not kicking Mr. Acker off his property. This, of course, being reinforced and supported by her boss, Rich Schweiger, to Kevin Wachtel. At the end of the day, though, despite all of this and despite all of this effort that Kim went through for Mr. Acker, Kevin digs his heels in and basically says, this is my land, I have the right to build on it, it's my legal right, I'm not budging on 1 inch on this call center. Of course, following this, Kim realizing that despite all of these efforts, if Kevin really digs his heels in, there's nothing that she can do at this point in time, and this scene thus concludes Act 2 in this episode. Alright, so then following this, the first scene in Act 3 then picks up with Jimmy and Kim at their apartment. Of course, in this scene, we see them both kind of resigned to the fact that due to the fact that Kevin is digging his heels in, there's really nothing more they can do for Mr. Acker here. Jimmy even going so far as to say that Kim really stuck her neck out for this guy and really telling Kim all that she risked in her career to protect Mr. Acker and that she's gone above and beyond the call of duty for him. And of course, not making any sense to further this sort of plan based on everything that could happen legally to Kim. Of course, despite all this, in very Saul Goodman fashion, Jimmy then proposes to Kim that there is one more sort of DEFCON 1 potential plan to get Mesa Verde to cease building the call center on Mr. Acker's land, and this, of course, would be to go after Kevin Wachtel on a personal level. Of course, while this is not really Kim's cup of tea, if you will, at this point in time, we, of course, based on her continuing sort of moral compass morph and shift that's occurred over the course of Better Call Saul, we get to see her agree to go through with Jimmy's plan here, despite us knowing that Kim's initial reaction to a plan like this a few seasons prior would have been absolutely not. But of course, with the whole premise of this plot being Kim's sort of shifting moral change, we then see this plot continue based on Jimmy McGill's new plan here in this scene. Then following this, the next scene in this act then picks up with Mike back in Mexico, again further resting there because there's really nothing else he can do. He's sort of resigned to his fate at this point in time. He's then awoken by a call from Jimmy, where Jimmy requests his services to sort of be a legal PI, which is implied that he would spy on Kevin for their plan. Of course, Mike, being in the situation he's in, denies Jimmy's request, of course, without telling him exactly his predicament. Of course, that sort of ends the scene between these two characters here. The scene then continues off with Mike in Mexico, where we see him helping Mrs. Cortazar stop a leaky window. The scene then pans from night to day, where we see Mike eating breakfast with Mrs. Cortazar, sort of, following the initial sort of anger and resentment of the situation. We sort of see Mike here, after being resigned to his fate, sort of accept his situation, sort of just embrace the fact that he's stuck in the situation and he has to just go about it. So then following this and following some cordialities between these two characters, we then see Mike work and fix this leaky window in very typical Mike fashion. When something's broken, it's just kind of Mike's instinct to fix it. Alright, so then following this, the third scene in this act, Act 3, then picks up with Jimmy and Kim at the nail salon, where we see them waiting for a different PI who Jimmy hired here because Mike could not work for them. In this scene, in this dialogue, it's outright implied that Jimmy went via the vet, Caldera, to get a new PI, sort of telling Kim about the background of his knowledge in this sort of Albuquerque criminal underworld. As a side note here, before the reveal of this character being the henchman, Mr. X, who we first met and hadn't seen since all the way back in Season 1 of Better Call Saul in the episode entitled Pimento, it was sort of revealed here that this scene was initially planned for a different character, aka Kubi, aka Bill Burr, but of course I made a whole video on the subject matter. You can go back and watch that if you want. But with the benefit of hindsight, it is actually kind of interesting here to definitely know that the original dialogue in the scene was, of course, definitely probably changed to sort of more fit the character Mr. X as opposed to Kubi, and I definitely think that the dialogue would have been completely different had Bill Burr been in the scene. But again, that's a discussion for a different video. So despite all of this, we then see in this scene that Mr. X did the reconnaissance work for Jimmy and Kim to try to get some dirt on Kevin Wachtel to use against him, to go after him personally, as Jimmy stated in the previous scene. Of course, to their chagrin, Mr. X reveals to them that he's absolutely squeaky clean. He has no dirt on him whatsoever. Of course, with Jimmy sort of pressing him, saying, outright insinuating that his work might have been not very thorough, it's then revealed to us that not only was it very thorough, but he went maybe even above what Kim would ever even imagine a PI would do, and of course broke into Kevin Wachtel's house. Of course, a very interesting scene here in this episode, which kind of shows, Jimmy in very Jimmy fashion, always believing that the ends justify the means here, and sort of just shaking off the fact that they hired a PI to commit a crime. Of course, Kim having way more reservations here, of course, knowing that this character should not have broken into Kevin Wachtel's house. That's not what they meant by getting reconnaissance work on him. Of course, then following this, and we then see Mr. X even going above and beyond, offering to kidnap Kevin Wachtel, and then Saul saying, okay, thank you for your service, that's enough. Of course, us initially thinking that this plan did not work. We then see the photographs that Mr. X took inside Kevin Wachtel's office. We then see Kim sort of look at one of these photos and have a sort of grin on her face. Again, at this point in time, unbeknownst to the audience, it appears that Kim has found something to use on Kevin Wachtel, and of course, this scene then ends here. Again, a very interesting piece of foreshadowing that's going to set up the plot that occurs in the next episode, following episode 5. But again, a very interesting scene here with a lot of detail and a lot of subtleties that really show where these characters are at this point in time in the plot of Better Call Saul. Okay, so then following this scene, the final act, Act 4, then picks up with Kim at her office at Schweigert and Coakley. We see her sort of looking at an image that greatly resembles the photo she was looking at in the previous scene. Of course, a piece of foreshadowing unbeknownst to the audience at this point in time. Of course, her sort of reconnaissance work on her plan to keep Mr. Acker on his land is then interrupted by Rich Schweigert, who tells Kim that he no longer wants her to work on the Mesa Verde case and wants her to work on a different case. Of course, Kim sort of feigning ignorance here as to why this request is being proposed by Rich. It's then revealed to us that despite Kevin and Paige not seeing through Kim's charade, that Rich sees right through her long con of having Jimmy represent Mr. Acker. And of course, following this and following Kim realizing that the jig is up, she then decides to double down on her ruse by confronting her boss in public at her office. Of course, in this scene, we see Kim, state outright in a sort of very interesting manner, why would she risk all of this for some lowlife like Mr. Acker? Of course, this was the question that I think, along with all of the audience, was asking at the time. Why is Kim doing this? And of course, that's this question that she asked Rich here when she's sort of doubling down and trying to emotionally manipulate Rich like she did with Paige and Kevin. That's really the whole crux of this entire plot. Why is Kim risking all of this in her professional life for Mr. Acker? That's the huge question here. What is causing Kim to act out in this manner and change compared to the character who was so taken aback by the whole squat cobbler plot, for instance, where Jimmy fabricated evidence, which is totally not allowed by any reputable lawyer? What is causing Kim here to act out in this manner? Again, at this point in time, we just don't know. We can only speculate following the conclusion of the 5th episode of Better Call Saul halfway through season 5. Again, as I said, this is sort of the whole crux here of this plot. Again, following Kim confronting her boss in public in front of the entire office. We then see Rich return to his office and Kim return to hers, and this scene then concludes here. Of course, quite an interesting cliffhanger that will pick up in the next episode of Better Call Saul, but like I said before, that's sort of the main question here. Why is Kim risking so much for Mr. Acker? What is going on in her head that's causing her to act out in this manner? Alright, so following this, the very final scene of Act 4 of this episode then picks up with the plot of Mike Ehrmantraut back in Mexico. We then see him finishing up the construction on the leaky window and fixing the window leak that he started in the previous act. His work is then, of course, interrupted by a very familiar voice, which he then realizes is the voice of Gus Fring. Of course, following Mike realizing that Gus is here, this scene then finally culminates with this meeting that has clearly been building between these two characters for several episodes over the course of this season. In this scene, we see a very cynical Mike Ehrmantraut confront Gus Fring. Of course, Mike being extremely cynical to this entire premise, sort of just calling Gus nothing but a drug dealer and saying that if he works for him, he would just work for a drug dealer, killing other drug dealers. Of course, Mike even going so far as to state to Gus that he's no different than the Salamancas, the people who Gus is in a war with, to use Gus Fring's own words. Of course, it should be noted that in this scene, it is outwardly stated by Gus Fring that this place is a memorial of some kind. Of course, with him not telling Mike all the details at this point in time, but of course with the benefit of hindsight and the backstory of Breaking Bad, we as the audience know exactly what Gus Fring is talking about here. Of course, following all of these propositions and all of this cynicism by Mike, this scene then finally culminates with the question of Mike asking Gus, why me? Why me of all people do you want to work for you as a soldier in your war against the Salamancas? And Gus then finally says that he wants Mike because he believes that Mike understands the concept of revenge. Again, a lot of things here that are only implied and of course are based entirely on the backstory of Breaking Bad, and you need to know the plot of Gus Fring's revenge against the Salamancas, which I've talked about in many previous videos. Again, so much detail here, almost don't have time to go into all of it. If you want to go back and watch some videos on that, I would definitely recommend it. But anyway, the main point of the scene here is basically this scene absolutely needed to happen in the plot of Better Call Saul in order to complete the transformation of Mike Ehrmantraut that has taken place over the course of 5 entire seasons of Better Call Saul. Because in short, as I've talked about in my previous videos, Mike Ehrmantraut was not the character who we first met in the plot of Breaking Bad, a henchman who would kill at will. A cold-blooded henchman who would kill for Gus Fring. We even saw him in Better Call Saul go as so far as to not kill someone like Tuco Salamanca, when in the plot of Breaking Bad, he absolutely would kill a character like that. So again, this entire backstory, again, needed to happen in order to sort of create the character Mike Ehrmantraut, who we met in the plot of Breaking Bad. And this was done via Mike going through some serious emotional hardships and having a really tough time dealing with the death of Werner Ziegler, him having to kill Werner. This, of course, then led to an impasse with his family. Of course, then Gus stating to him that him being a drunkard and being emotionally distant from his family was no way to live his life, and that, there's really nothing that Mike can do to change what happened in the past, and all he can do is move forward. And Gus Fring, by saying that this whole entire premise between him and the Salamancas is about revenge almost sort of implies that Gus knows the backstory of Mike and his son, Matty, and his plot of revenge. A final sort of emotional proposition to get Mike to fully buy in to Gus Fring and what he's doing in his life, even if it is, as Mike said, in the grand scheme of things, him just being a drug dealer. So again, a very complex plot here, so much implied backstory that came directly from the plot of Breaking Bad here, but again, a scene and a plot that absolutely needed to happen in this episode in order to finally conclude the plot of Mike Ehrmantraut, where we really see him over the course of the next few episodes pretty much come full circle and be the character who we first met in the plot of Breaking Bad. Alright, so that pretty much sums it up here. That was the 5th episode of Better Call Saul, Dedicado a Max. Again, in my opinion, an absolutely amazing episode. I mean, so much going on here, so much plot development intertwined with so much humor and comedy. Again, an unbelievable montage scene here, one of my favorites in the entirety of Better Call Saul. I thought the cinematography was absolutely great. It was really cool to see these shots of Mexico here and the way that the show contrasts that to the scenes in Albuquerque. Just an unbelievable episode in my opinion, halfway through Season 5 of Better Call Saul. Alright, yeah, so that's all I really got. Again, I'm actually pretty surprised that Season 6 of Better Call Saul hasn't started yet, but I think it's going to start pretty soon. I think Peter Gould put out a tweet of some kind that showed that they are currently filming or wrapping up production on the 13th and final episode of Season 6 of Better Call Saul, so I think we'll probably see it pretty soon, maybe in the next few months. So who knows, maybe I'll have time to finish the last 5 reviews, episodes 6 through 10 of Season 5 of Better Call Saul, and I hope I have some time to do it before Season 6 starts. So anyway, yeah, if you're still watching at this point in time, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you guys around.